not leveraging Indigenous ingenuity, I think is just a giant missed opportunity for our collective effort to mitigate climate change.
Hi, welcome to Everyday Climate Champions, where we speak with inspiring community members here in the San Francisco Bay Area about how they're putting real climate solutions into action. This is Dalya Massachi, your host for this episode of Everyday Climate Champions. Today I get to speak with Shaandiin Cedar, a tribal member of the Navajo Nation and an advocate for Indigenous-Led climate action. She currently works in clean tech investing at Powerhouse Ventures, where she's dedicated to the equitable and timely transition to a clean economy. Shaandiin and I discussed how Indigenous communities can help lead the way to addressing our climate crisis. I'll let her introduce herself.
Shaandiin Cedar, Yinishiye, Scots Irish Nishle, Chisha Dene Bashachin, Choctaw Dashache, Nakai Dene Dashinale. Hello, my name is Shaandiin Cedar, and it's good to be here with you today. What I said before is on my mother's side, I am Scots Irish and Choctaw, and on my father's side, I am Chisha and Nakai Dene. And today I am actually calling in from the traditional homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, also known as Evergreen, Colorado, just outside of Denver. But most recently, I am coming from Ohlone, Miwok, and Muwekma land, also known as Oakland, California, in the Bay Area. And that is where I have lived for the past 6 years. So thanks so much for having me, and excited to chat with you today.
Thanks for joining us, Shaandiin. I wanted to ask about your experience on the Navajo Nation reservation in Arizona. Can you tell me a bit about what you saw there in terms of environmental impact?
Yes. So as a child, I spent quite a lot of time with my grandmother, my Nali, my aunts, cousins up near an area called Big Mountain, which is right in the heart of Navajo Nation in northeastern Arizona. And it's an area that my family has lived for generations. It's really, big sky country up there. And as a kid, I got a lot of freedom to fall in love with the land. Simultaneously, even at a young age, I got the sense that there was this complex conflict going on between the adults in my life and this large outside company feel and their projects developing uranium and coal on Navajo. For example, folks might have heard about the contentious Peabody coal mine and its related coal-fired generating station called Navajo Generating Station. And the promise there back in the day was, jobs and economic prosperity to the Navajo Nation government and people. And the plant has since been decommissioned, thankfully. But during its lifetime, the mine and plant had a tremendous negative impact. So as a kid, we heard stories about poisoned livestock from contaminated groundwater. Since coal bricks were a cheap way to heat homes, many of our community members still today deal with lung and respiratory illnesses. And the Navajo Nation also hosted several uranium mines, which had similar impacts on local communities. So this is a really complex issue, and I definitely want to highlight the fact that these projects did provide needed steady paychecks for a lot of people. But in my opinion, it came at an immense social, cultural, and environmental cost.
I understand that one of your first jobs was with the International Center for Appropriate and Sustainable Technology. Can you tell me about that?
They specifically focus on getting energy efficiency and renewable energy into low-income multifamily housing. So spent a few years there and really fell in love with this idea of climate justice and equity and how we get technology into the hands of communities that need it most.
Interesting. I wanted to pick up on the phrase climate justice. I've seen it tossed around a lot, and I wondered, what does it look like from your perspective?
Yes, so we really know that climate change is happening. We know that it will not impact us all equally, and that the populations most impacted by climate change are often low income and communities of color. Additionally, these folks typically have limited carbon footprints and are not really responsible for causing the emissions driving climate change. So, an instance of climate injustice would be what's going on right now in Alaska, where Native Alaskan coastal communities are having to relocate their homes, their traditional fishing and hunting grounds because of rising sea level and drastic temperature changes. An example of climate justice success would be more instances where funding, infrastructure, and community resources are proportionally invested in impacted communities. But I think it needs to be more than that. A lot of Native groups really want to be ingrained into state and local government decision making policies around climate adaptation.
Yes, it's very important to both acknowledge and address climate injustice when it comes to adapting to climate impacts that are already happening. Also, what about mitigating future climate harms by centering the work and knowledge of Indigenous people?
Not leveraging Indigenous ingenuity, I think, is just a giant missed opportunity for our collective effort to mitigate climate change, especially when it comes to land management, biodiversity, protecting major carbon sinks around the world. 21% of land on Earth remains ecologically intact due to the conservation practices of Indigenous people and local communities. And that's more than all of the Earth's national parks and forests. And despite the fact that Indigenous people make up just 5% of the global population, they protect 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, which is incredible. The quick takeaway here is Indigenous land wisdom, ownership is really a proven localized climate solution that has far reaching implications. But I think it really often is an overlooked solution. And I do think it's critical to leverage their perspectives if we want to get ahead of this.
Can you give me some examples of those climate friendly Indigenous practices?
Yeah. Luckily, there, really are so many examples that we can pull from Indigenous people around the world. So one that I talk a lot about is this concept of regenerative agriculture is basically concept where farmers use farming and grazing practices that rebuild soil organic matter and really restore degraded soil biodiversity. And in this process, carbon is drawn down and stored in the soil. And it's really an ancient concept that Indigenous peoples have been deploying for thousands and thousands of years. Maybe they weren't aware of the climate benefits, but they absolutely were aware of the crop output and sustainability of the practice. Some other examples are agroforestry, intercropping, sustainable water and land management. All of these are well documented and great examples of Indigenous wisdom. And the other thing that I wanted to make sure I touched on is this cultural ideology that a lot of North American Indigenous communities hold to be true. And it's the framework of living in consideration with the seventh generation, which in its simplest form is a philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. And I love this framework because it highlights and contrasts with the kind of more myopic, short-term, quarterly return output standard. I think there's a lot of instances where we can learn a lot from Indigenous wisdom. And as a result, I think yeah, we do need to bring more Native and Indigenous perspectives and solutions into the mainstream climate spaces.
Shaandiin, I know that you've been an advocate for the tribal program at the organization called Grid Alternatives. Can you tell me about them?
Absolutely. Grid Alternatives, which is based in Oakland, partners with tribes to implement solar projects. And they do a lot of not only delivering projects to homes, but making sure that homeowners understand the system. They do a lot on hands-on training, so community members can go get trained and be paid to install this technology within their communities. A lot of folks, you go to their home, their hogan, and they don't have anything still. I even remember as a kid looking across the valley and only seeing one or two pinpricks of light. Um, and, there's dozens and dozens of family living in this valley. And so organizations like this, and there's several different organizations doing similar things across North America, they really, really do provide this win-win-win situation where homeowners gain energy savings, they have better indoor air quality, home comfort. If the grid goes down, they have a viable backup option for lighting and heating. It's a win for tribal governments in terms of the right to make their own decisions on energy generation and consumption. And the last win is just on climate for obvious reasons.
Sounds great. What do you think is holding back solutions like this?
Scalability is probably the obvious one, and that comes just from having resources and funding to get off-grid solar onto a home. They really just need partners to help them scale. But the other one that has been really interesting to navigate is the pattern of outside entities coming in to quote unquote help the people or give them jobs or give them prosperity and independence is a pattern that hasn't gone well for a lot of Indigenous groups. So I think there is a healthy skepticism of organizations coming into communities.
Before I let you go, Shaandiin, I want to ask if you have some ideas for our non-Native listeners who want to be allies with Indigenous communities on climate justice issues.
I think a first good step is doing a quick search on whose land you're on and what local tribal entity resides there. There's a online resource that makes this super, super easy. It's called the Native Lands app. You just put in a location and it will show you what Indigenous groups occupy the land that you live on and work and play on, and their history and how to get in contact.
Yes, the Native Land app is also a website.
Yeah, so reach out to your local tribal entity and see what their needs are. And then trying to connect the dots between what you can give, what you're passionate about. And if they do have some sort of really cool sustainability programming, that can be really great for both parties.
Excellent. Thanks again for this insightful conversation, Shaandiin. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. It's great to be here and just want to invite everyone to engage in any way that makes sense for them.
Hey, listeners, look below this episode's description to find links to all the resources Shaandiin mentioned, including ways you can get involved. You'll also find a transcript. Please let us know what you think of this podcast with the link below to our brief listener feedback survey. You can also help us spread the word by sharing the show with a few friends. And if you click the follow or subscribe button, you'll hear about new episodes as soon as they get released. For this episode of Everyday Climate Champions, the sound engineer was Martin Sanchez. My name is Dalya Massachi, and I'm also the executive producer and editor. Our full production team is listed below. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. You've been listening to Everyday Climate Champions, presented by the Climate Reality Project's Bay Area chapter. If you know any local folks who would make great guests, please drop us an email. As Climate Reality founder and former U.S. Vice President Al Gore says, solving the climate crisis is within our grasp, but we need people like you to stand up and act. To learn more, please visit climaterealitybayarea.org. See you next time.